name is Tom Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of Southern Windsor County Regional Planning Commission. Peter Gregory is over there, casually dressed, I'm jealous about. He's with Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission. I don't know if anyone from Wyndham Regional Commission is here. But the regional planning commissions have been working with the Agency of Natural Resources on energy planning for a number of years. We started out probably 5 years ago working with towns. Many of you who are on energy committees work with regional planning commissions to enhance your energy element to your town plan. And regional planning commissions did the same thing, working on trying to have a better understanding of the demands and for energy. One of the things that we found that was glaring in trying to meet the 2050 state energy goal is transportation. Is that we're doing a pretty good job, or we were doing a pretty good job with facilities and the like, but when it came to the transportation sector, we weren't even getting close to trying to meet the goals of 2050. And so this is really exciting that now we're starting to have a public discussion about transportation and what we can do to reduce greenhouse gases. So welcome all, and sorry.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Peter Walke. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources and have been the state's lead on the Transportation and Climate Initiative for the last 3 years. I'm joined, you're going to hear from Megan O'Toole, who's an attorney in our agency program, and then Brian Woods as well, who's one of our technical experts. Really appreciate everybody coming out. This is our third of 4 public meetings around the state where we're introducing the Transportation and Climate Initiative, the work that we've been doing as a state, what it might mean for us, and the kind of conversation that's happening both within the region and around the state as to whether or not this is a policy proposal that the state wants to move forward with. So, as I said, we really want, the goal of this is to get your feedback. We are in the middle of a regional public input period. We're trying to hear from as many people, both from Vermonters, but also the other states are doing the same sort of work to understand the perspectives of their residents around the region. We'll go into what that region actually looks like so you can sort of see the range of folks we're talking about. And then to talk to you about sort of what the timeline is as we move forward and what the next steps are and opportunities for further engagement. We've all lived the extreme weather of recent years and the impacts that a changing climate are having on our communities, on our economy, and our way of life here in Vermont. We feel that strong impetus for action, and we want to make sure that we are moving forward with programs and policies that are helping us get there. As Tom mentioned, transportation emissions represent 44% of our greenhouse gas emissions. The next largest sector is our sort of building energy use, and that's about 27%. We talk a lot about renewable energy. Renewable energy, or energy itself, electric energy, represents less than 10% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions at this point, and it's going down. We're not making progress in the transportation sector, and we need to if we're going to reach those goals and really mitigate the worst impacts of our climate crisis. So this is just a history of where we've been in the last less than 10 years. From Irene on, the scale of challenge we faced, and the reason why we as a state are interested in making sure that we're moving forward with action commensurate to the level of the challenge. This yellow line, which is probably a little hard to see from where you are, is our historical greenhouse gas emissions. We start in 1990 as what we sort of consider our baseline year for the most part. In 2007, the legislature set goals of 50% below 1990 levels by 2028 and 75% below by 2050. There was actually a 2012 goal of 25% below, which we flew by and didn't even come close to. We are not likely to make those either, frankly, on our current trajectory. We have, for the first time in recent years, actually gone down slightly in our most recent data. That data is from 2016. It takes a while for the federal government and others to consolidate all the data so we know where we are. So the most recent complete data we have is 2016, but what we have of 2017 and 2018, we see further downticks and are optimistic that we're at least trending in the right direction. We have other goals in the state. The 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 is in the comprehensive energy plan that was done in 2016. There's also an 80% below 1990 levels the comprehensive energy plan by 2050. And 80 to 95%, so that's the range you see here on the right. As you can see, there's one of those lines does not meet the trend that we need to be on to reach those goals. We also have the governor signaled Vermont's continued support to meet the Vermont's contribution to the U.S. goal for the Paris Climate Accords after the federal government pulled out of or signaled that they were going to pull out. That is a 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. That's what that goal looks like. That one is a little bit easier to get, frankly, but it's not sufficient to get us where we need to be from a scientific standpoint. So this is how all those pieces fit together and where the trajectory we need to be on as we move forward. As I said, transportation represents 44% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions as a reflection of where the rest of the country is. Electric generation is still a major player. Transportation has actually taken over around the country as the greatest source of emissions. But in Vermont, it's our primary, and we really need to be focused there. Get it up to make it open.
Good evening, my name is Megan O'Toole. I'm also with the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm going to spend a few minutes just kind of getting into the mechanics of how this program would work. And I want to start off by talking first about a program that we have in place that Vermont participates in right now. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's like the TCI mechanism but for emissions from the electricity sector. So the RGGI program, as we call it, right now consists of 9 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. It was launched a little over 10 years ago, and it's still in existence today. It covers major power plants or electricity generating units, and they're required to buy allowances at auction. And then the revenue that's generated from those auctions is invested in efficiency initiatives or other programs as decided by each state that participates to drive down consumer demand of electricity. So to date, RGGI has been a part in contributing to over 40% reduction in emissions from the electricity sector, and has resulted in a lifetime energy bill savings of over $9 million as of 2017. Excuse me, $9 billion.
9 billion regionally, yeah.
Yes, $9 billion in the region, not Vermont. And RGGI is growing. Pennsylvania has recently made moves to join RGGI, and their governor has directed their energy agency to adopt rules to join RGGI. So we're currently working with them, and then Virginia has adopted rules and hopefully will begin implementing the program within the next 2 years.
We hope to have them by 2021.
Okay. So the TCI region looks a little similar to RGGI, and TCI isn't really a new organization. It's been around for quite a while. The states in TCI have been working since 2010 to address emissions from the transportation sector in the region, and recently have been engaged in regional listening sessions, and then in December 2018, all of the jurisdictions committed to a year-long program, which ended at the end of 2019, to further develop what this regional cap and invest program would look like. The program goals include obviously reducing carbon emissions by utilizing a market-based mechanism to drive down emissions, and then investing the proceeds from the auctions to reduce emissions, increase resiliency, and then provide net economic and social benefits in the region.
Can we take questions now, or would you rather wait?
I think we're gonna wait till the end,
Okay.
if that's okay. Yeah, okay. So just to talk about where we are in the process in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned in in 2019, we released a draft framework that kind of, from a very high level, explained how the program would work. We gathered input on that framework throughout the late fall of last year, and then we released a draft memorandum of understanding in December, which provided a lot more detail about how the program would function, who would be regulated, and details like that. And then we're now working on gathering public input on the draft MOUs, which is this meeting tonight is part of that process. And then we're hoping to begin developing a model rule and finalizing the MOU throughout the rest of this year. And then if that timeline stays on track, hopefully the program would be implemented in 2022. So just kind of digging a little deeper into how Cap and Invest works. So you have an overall cap, which is a limit on the region's carbon dioxide emissions that would be released from the combustion of transportation fuels that are covered under the program. This cap is based on an initial business as usual baseline level, and then the cap is reduced from that level over time. And the way that regulated entities under the program that are kind of emitting under that cap participate is they have to buy allowances that are equal to the amount of carbon dioxide that they emit from the fuels that are covered under the program. The fuel that they sell that emits the carbon dioxide. And then in order to obtain these allowances, they purchase them at auction. In the RGGI program, we hold 4 auctions a year, so every quarter. And then there's also a secondary market under RGGI where people that hold allowances can trade those allowances as well to make sure that they have enough, they're holding enough allowances to meet their compliance obligation. And then the revenue that is generated from the sale of those allowances is received by the participating states, and then the states can decide as individual states how to invest the proceeds from the sale of those allowances, and ideally that would be to invest in programs that would reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. So the TCI program would follow that model that I just described. Again, the cap would ensure that reductions would occur and that cap would be lowered over time, but the market, the allowance market itself would determine the cost of the reduction in emissions. Emission reductions would hopefully result from investments and complementary policies that are put in place from the revenue from the sale of allowances. Throughout this entire program, equity has been a very strong theme in terms of determining investment from the revenue generated. And then obviously another focus is the health benefits that the region would receive from reduction in emissions, and then also the macroeconomic benefits. The program framework has had 12 common themes throughout the process of developing the framework of the program and then also the MOU. I won't read all of them, but just highlight a few. Obviously, equity is again a top priority. We also focus on, who the regulated entities are going to be, who are the entities that actually have to purchase these allowances in the quarterly auctions, and then, demonstrate compliance with enough allowances equal to the fuel that they sell and the carbon dioxide that fuel emits. Let's see, what else? Investment of proceeds is obviously something that we're focusing on in the public process, and where those investments should be made to see emission reductions, but then also to make sure that we're considering equity in those investments as well, and the different populations and communities that would be affected throughout the state. So again, equity, fundamental tenet of the program, and it'll be addressed by a state level, recognizing that each state in the program has unique, communities and unique needs, and then also, unique transportation emission issues. So in Vermont, those issues are, definitely affordability and then access to different transportation options. So Brian, I'm gonna let you take it from here.
Thanks. So I'm Brian Woods with the Department of Environmental Conservation. So I'm going to cover some of the things that Megan talked about in a little bit more detail. We're going to talk a little bit about the covered fuels and a little bit about the modeling, the computer modeling of the fuel sector that we're using in order to be able to inform program design. So how it is that we're making choices on how to develop and implement the program. What are the things that, like setting the cap levels and the rate of decline. So this is a view you're all familiar with, so I thought I would start with this. The affected fuels and emissions. The fuels are these on-road transportation fuels, so motor gasoline on the right, and diesel fuel on the left, on-road diesel on the left. It's the fossil fuel portion only. I'm going to talk a little bit about the composition, but it's the fossil portion only of these fuels. It was only for on-road use, so in the diesel section, in the diesel sector, they, that fuels that are used for off-road uses, for agriculture and for construction, for example, are separated out. They're actually dyed, similar also to your heating oil, and it's not taxed in the same way. So that makes it easy to separate, for us to track and separate the on-road diesel from transportation that we're trying to manage with this program from the rest of the fuels. The little sign that you're familiar with says 10% ethanol in gasoline, so that's a biofuel. We're not counting, for the time being, the biofuel portion of either gasoline, which is 10% and maybe go up to 15%, or in diesel, which can be blended up to a 5% level with biodiesel, and regionally I think we are seeing numbers between 3 and 4 right now. We recognize that biofuels are not emission-free, but they, in certain cases, may have lower emission profiles than fossil energy as well. So the states are still considering how it is they're going to treat biofuels going forward, but it's important to recognize that one, we know they're not zero, but we need to be able to count them in some ways. We want to be able to count the right fuels so that if we are using biofuels as a pathway to compliance, to lower our emissions, that's actually what is going to be happening. It's no surprise to you that virtually 100% of the fuels that we get into that we use in the region come from someplace else. And this is a depiction from the Energy Information Administration that shows the fuel flows coming into New England. It's one of the 7 areas that the federal government uses to be able to track petroleum flows. So I'm going to focus mostly on Vermont, but basically the big picture is we get fuel that comes in from the south by barge or pipeline. It comes in from Canada by tankers here, and it also comes in by rail or truck from either out west and then into a terminal in Albany. So in Burlington, we are seeing fuel coming in a lot by rail that comes into Burlington for distribution. We are also in Vermont, we receive fuel from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that comes across by tanker truck, some from Portland, Maine, and then also from Canada. There's a fuel terminal that's up in Canada, in Montreal, and folks will go there and bring fuel down to serve the northern part of Vermont. So kind of the big picture of where we get our transportation fuels, and that's important because it informs how it is we are actually going to implement the program and who are the folks that are going to be subject to the regulation. This is the same information without the map, but that shows the same thing. So we have imported crude that comes to refineries. We have refineries outside the region, also inside in Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey have some oil refineries. They refine the crude oil, make gasoline or diesel, and then they move it to bulk storage terminals, and those are those big terminals in those municipal areas that were on the map before. A lot of that gets moved by rail or barge or tanker. And then from there, it gets into your tanker truck and gets delivered to your retail gas station, which you've all seen. So our primary point of regulation is going to be at the bulk fuel storage terminal. So at the terminal in Albany, they have the big tanks, and they have something called a terminal rack. And the trucks pull up, and then the fuel is delivered across the rack to the trucks, and then it goes to the retail station. That fuel is owned before it transfers across the rack by someone that's called, we call a position holder. So basically, the person or the entity that owns that fuel. All this motor fuel is taxed in every state, and those volumes are all tracked. And those people, those position holders, need to report that I sold X number of gallons of gasoline to this person, and it was going to Vermont. So all this information already exists at that level. And we want to try and regulate the emissions from fuels at the highest possible level. It's more efficient for program operation. These are generally larger operators that have a better capacity to be able to provide us with this information, which, as I said, they're collecting already as well. That will work in most of the cases, but in some cases, and I'll use the Montreal case as an example, it's a little more difficult for us to get information from the position holders at the Montreal terminal. So as a secondary point of regulation, that's this, we would be looking at the folks that are the distributors that are actually bringing the fuel into Vermont as well, or into the TCI region. So again, they know how much fuel they bought, they know how much they are importing into the region and where they're delivering it. Again, all subject to reporting regarding taxes. So we'll be able to capture that information in order to be able to calculate what their emissions would be, and then for them to be able to acquire the allowances that Megan was talking about in order to be able to demonstrate compliance. So that's the folks that we're going to be getting information from, and we're going to be complying with the program. A little review, the program will set an initial cap on emissions from transportation fuel. I have a figure that shows this better, the next slide or two. We have to pick an initial cap in the starting year, 2022. We're looking at the historical 3-year baseline emissions from these motor fuels. There's lots of information that's available to us to be able to do that. And we also have these computer models that I was talking about that are able to estimate what emissions would be in 2022 for a starting program. When you start to build a program like this, the first thing you want to know is, so what's the world going to be like if we don't do anything? If the program doesn't exist? What will happen in the absence of this program? And so we have this model that says, if we make assumptions about things like what the price of petroleum is going to be. To actually get that number from the federal government, they do an annual report that projects what the price of fuel and oil is going to be for the next 30 years. We want to know, for example, what vehicles, motor vehicle fuel emission standards are going to be. You may have heard that there's a potential change in those fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks. That might change, that might make them less efficient over time. So those are two important factors that can affect what the business as usual case would be. So under the standard, the regular business as usual assumptions that the federal government uses, and assuming that the federal vehicle standards stay as they had been, so increasing fuel efficiency, we would expect from 2022 to 2032 this 19% reduction in emissions. That's in the absence of this program. But the future might not unfold that way. So we did look at a low, like a high emissions sensitivity. So what happens if gas is cheap, so people buy more? And what happens if the vehicle fuel standards are held or rolled back? So cars the fleet doesn't turn over as fast and cars burn more gasoline. Well, then emissions are going to be higher. And so we projected with this analysis that it might be, under business as usual, we would only get a 6% reduction in emissions in that 10-year period that I talked about. So that's the case without the program. We examined now 3 policy cases. So now this is what, if we added a program, what would that look like? We looked at 3 cases, and that's hard to read, but it's the purple line is a 20% reduction, so the baseline at 19, so a 20% reduction over those 10 years, a 22% reduction, and a 25% reduction in emissions in that 10-year period. And yes, I'm the first one to admit that those look modest, and there's a couple of reasons for that. We don't have ready substitutes for gasoline ready to go. Electricity is certainly getting to be more viable, but there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made before that's like everybody's everyday vehicle choice as well. So there's not ready substitutes like there were for electricity, for renewables, for example, that we had in the RGGI program to work with. So modest reductions could come at higher costs, and the states are very cognizant of that. But what's important to recognize, and why we still I still have this blue shaded area up here, is that if you're looking at that regular business as usual case, we may only be getting this up to 6% reduction over the time period, but the program locks in those reductions. It sets the cap, and then that's the level of emissions that's going to come from the sector over time. So if the future unfolds where oil is cheap or cars aren't becoming as efficient, we still capture these reductions, and that's an important component of the program. Everybody wants to know, so what's this going to cost me, right? Peter said, you know, we already are paying the costs anyway, but just in a different way. We're not paying them when we buy the gallon of fuel. We're paying them in this, you know, flood recovery, disaster recovery, in costs to repairs to the electrical system that we see because of these events. So here on the left is the historical variation in gas prices, and it's relative. It's not the absolute price. It's relative to the price in 2019. So in 2019, the relative price is 0. But as you all know, the price of gasoline goes way up and it goes way down, and it's largely out of our control. It's a global market for fuel, and as you know, global events happen, there's shortages, there's surpluses, the price is very, very volatile. We translated the allowance prices that Megan alluded to. We auction the allowances, the market finds the price for what these allowances. We're able to translate those allowance prices into prices that you would see, that we would expect to see, what the model says would be at the fuel pump. So in 2022, at the most modest, at that 20% cap reduction, that purple line at the bottom, we are modeling a 5-cent increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline in 2022. At the out year, it goes up to like 7 cents a gallon. On the high end, the starting price is 15 cents a gallon, and it goes up to 29. Those increases are largely a factor of the way the model looks at money over time. It's the discount rate that we're using in the model. But the takeaway here is that, yeah, this is not anticipated to be a costless program, but as compared to the price volatility that people normally see in gasoline, is not meant to be extreme. Peter, do you want to take over from here? Sure. Thanks.
Sure, I want to run in a little more detail on what the anticipated impacts of the program would be. I just want to reiterate one point, that we're doing all this modeling at the regional level. All of these participation in these programs are individual state decisions. So each state is going through the same process right now to decide whether they want to participate. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we or anybody else will participate. And so I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. So we looked at, as Brian said, the 3 different cap scenarios. This goes into a little bit more detail so we can see what those mean, what the allowance price itself, what the auction is going to bear in terms of a price, what the impact is for the price at the pump, the overall sort of regional proceeds, and then in terms of what Vermont might expect to see from those proceeds, and then finally what we anticipate the regional health benefits of those programs being. So I'm going to read out some of them because you probably can't see them super well because the screen's a little small. But from the low end, from a regional proceeds perspective, you're talking about $1.4 billion worth of proceeds, up to the high end in the out year, $6.9 billion. For Vermont, that looks like an $18 to $80 million set of proceeds that can be used for programs to help Vermonters transition to different forms of transportation that uses less greenhouse gas emissions in the process. The other big point is not only does each state determine whether they're going to participate, they determine what they're going to do with those proceeds. So we could put them towards healthcare if we wanted to. We could put them towards anything. The benefits to the program, though, are as we help to reduce demand for transportation fuels and clean up the supply side through the cap. The balance of those creates the best price within the market, enables the compliance costs to come down, and therefore the impacts on everybody to be as low as possible. we may have shared priorities across the jurisdictions, we may commit to working together on different things, we may wanna work on sort of EV charging networks across the region or something of that nature. We may have shared priorities, but each of those spending decisions is going to be an individual state's decision. And then I really wanna go back to the point that Megan raised multiple times. This is a commitment to engage in meaningful conversations around how do we deal with issues of equity, how do we make sure that this is a program that is benefiting low-income Vermonters, impacting in a positive way rural communities who don't have access to other options for transportation at this moment. We've heard a lot around the state as we've engaged with Vermont communities about what people are interested in those proceeds going towards. Well, first and foremost, we hear, is it possible to use those proceeds to mitigate the impact of the lowest income Vermonters, essentially to provide a rebate in some form? That's an option. We've heard concerns about sort of how do we make sure that we are driving the smart growth that we want to see that ultimately is going to create the towns and villages and communities that we need that enables a low emissions transportation future. Heard a lot about the transition to electric vehicles, about transit and different forms of transit, and how do we maintain that transit system? How do we electrify that transit system? How do we support bike and pedestrian infrastructure? And then how do we look at different ride sharing and other ways in which to share the vehicles that we're using now? Those are all options, along with 1,000 others. That sort of revenue discussion sort of is the tail of this process, because as Brian and Megan mentioned, the program wouldn't anticipate to be launched until 2022. We wouldn't be seeing revenue until then. But it's important to have the conversation once, because if we talk about what it means in balance, then we can understand what the overall cost and benefits of the program. This is another example of sort of, we know that our overall greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals and the cap trajectories we've talked about aren't perfectly aligned. There are going to need to be other policies out there that exist and programs that help Vermonters transition in order to reach all of our goals. But we want to make sure that there are options on the table, so this is one that we want your input on, and whether or not this makes sense for us as a state. And then going back to where we are now, the key decision point for all of the states will be when the memorandum of understanding, that MOU that we put out, the draft that we're seeking your comment on now, that this conversation is based on, we will seek to finalize that in the spring. And so that is the point at which, as of right now, it's set up for a sort of gubernatorial decision. So the executive branches from each agency, or from each state, have come together to have this conversation. So it's set up right now for a gubernatorial decision in the spring timeframe to decide whether they want to move forward with the implementation of the program. From there, for each individual state, many need additional legislative authority, and everybody will need to have some sort of rule in place. And as Megan alluded to, we use what's known as a model rule. So we come up with the same form of regulation, and then we tailor it to meet our own specific sort of legal setups within each of our states, but that way the rules are the same for each state's individual program. And then we would be seeking to implement that program by 2022. There's a really important way in which we are collecting feedback on the program. It is, there's a regional stakeholder engagement platform where you can provide your comments. I would say dozens, if not hundreds of Vermonters have commented already. We've gotten really good input, and we hope that you will continue to do that. It says by Friday, February 28th, but the reality is there's no hard deadline to that. We will be reviewing and taking input throughout the whole process, and have been, so we welcome your input, and then we also have our own in-state website where you're happy to come and get some additional information and get our contact information if you'd like to ask us individual questions. To go to sort of who the leads for this has been a multi-agency team event. I'm Peter Walke, Michelle Boomhauer, and Dan Dutcher from the Agency of Transportation, Riley Allen and Phil Peacock from the Public Service Department have been heavily engaged, Ken Jones from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and we have quite a team from A&R who's looking at this, bringing their expertise from previous Reggie experience and other buildings. With that, we will take questions.
Are questions separate from comments?
Sure. We can do both at the same time. What I would ask everybody is we're going to try to let everybody have a chance to raise a comment or ask a question. So if you can, we'll do our best to sort of facilitate that and make sure that we get everybody who wants a chance to speak can speak. Did you have something you wanted to raise?
Let's have questions.
Okay, so lithium is mined,
Yes.
and lithium also produces more carbon and toxic gases, so how is this more beneficial to Vermont? Because mining is definitely not safe, and people don't like mining, so how is this gonna benefit Vermont? Because the gases produce more than what Vermont's carbon footprint already is.
I'm not aware of those facts, but I do understand there are all
My
sorts of.
cousin's a miner, so, and I did my homework before I came in, and I was just reading, so.
I would love to see that information so we can factor that into what we're thinking about.
Okay.
So if there's nobody else, I do have a comment.
Okay.
My name's John Cushman, I live in Norwich, Vermont, and I'm here to encourage you to produce a very strong memorandum so that we can have effective, affordable, equitable tools to meet our science-based climate goals. And I really appreciate the extent to which your briefing has been accurate and respectful of the science, because it tells us that we have to reduce our emissions to effectively zero as rapidly as possible. And the TCI would allow us to do so thoughtfully and in an economically sound way, because this market-based tool drives the lowest cost solutions to the front of the line. It's like a carpool lane on an interstate. The efficiency goes right to the front of the line. I noticed this week that the Department of Public Health reported that we can save the lives of 2,000 Vermonters in the coming 30 years and save more than $1 billion in health-related costs. This is not my estimate, it's your government's estimate. If we meet the goals, the transportation goals of our existing energy policies. I hope that you'll focus not on special interest pleadings from the fossil fuel industry and the Koch brothers misinformation effort. Fossil energy is not cheap once you stop treating pollution like a freebie. So I hope you'll base your work on peer-reviewed science, use the power of the marketplace for sound decisions. It sounds like you're doing that. Build in a just transition for workers and people with less money. It sounds like that's a priority. And make Vermont a good neighbor to surrounding communities who are doing the same thing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. I missed the time when this would be decided. You said it's a governor's decision?
So right now it's set up to be a governor's decision in the spring timeframe, so it's sort of
Spring of
sometime
2020.
Spring 2020.
Okay, and do we know how Phil Scott feels about this?
I think what he's said is that he wants to see the details of the program. I think he's skeptical of things that raise costs to consumers, but he sent us out, I worked for him, he sent us out to get the best deal we could for Vermont under this proposal, and he's, like everybody else, is looking at the details and wants to have a conversation with everybody about it.
Okay, so, good for him. All right, thanks.
I first want to say thank you. This is a program that I'm kind of excited for. It's a little overdue. I'm not sure if it's going to be timed in a way that's going to be terribly effective. And because of that, I'll just make a couple comments on, I've been coming to these kinds of things for years, looking at our goals and how we're not changing and that kind of stuff, how we're off a path. But every single one of these projections and paths that's been presented are based on a linear change pattern, which is not how this works. We have S-curves in our history, all throughout history, okay? Start mapping S-curves instead of lines, and you'll see that we're doing fine. Okay, we have work to do, but the short-term increases are part of a curve that's gonna dive steeply. And most importantly, I encourage each and every one of you to watch a video called Clean Energy Disruption by Tony Seba, if you haven't seen it already. And this will educate you on how this stuff works, and most importantly, to the transportation efforts, the disruptive change that is coming in the front half of the graphs you show that go out to 2030. By the time 2022 rolls around, you're gonna see amazing things happening in the area of transportation that most people can't begin to comprehend or understand how fast they're happening, just like smartphones took off and so many other technology disruptions happened before that. And it's all gonna be electric, and it's all gonna be near zero emission. The mining thing, don't sweat it too much. It's not the lithium, it's the cobalt, working on it, right? Bigger
It's the
issues with
toxic
cobalt.
gases.
The toxic gases coming out of our tailpipes are hundreds of or thousands of times worse than anything coming from a mine.
Volcanoes.
And all of the mine stuff, right? All the stuff coming from mines is coming from the fact that they're still using fossil fuels to do the mining. It's not the lithium, it's the way they get
Not
the
all of
lithium,
them.
and it's the slave labor. Again, cobalt's worse than lithium, lithium's not
Like,
the
doesn't
problem,
work,
it's the cobalt.
that company works, and they have solar panels, which is also.
Right, and there's companies moving in that direction. So that's why we're starting to see these short-term increases in carbon emissions, because we're making rapid change, and we have to live in the world we're in to get to the world we want to be in. We have to use the tools we have to make the transition. So get ready for this turn, and have your program be flexible. It's what you do with the money you collect that's going to be a bigger impact on than how you collect the money, and you're going to have to make some really big pivots in the next couple of years to do smart things with that money. One thing's for sure is you're going to see a dramatic reduction in the amount of fossil fuel being consumed by transportation within 5 years. Whether or not the price goes up or down really has more to do with what the Saudis want to do with their production than demand, and maybe Russia a little bit. But the volume and therefore your revenues from this program, right, if you don't increase the price of on the program, are going to be dramatically reduced. So I strongly encourage you to kind of look for, I feel like so much in government, and I'm involved in local government, I've been involved for a few years now, and so much of the time we spend steering the ship from the stern, right, looking behind us. We got to get out to the bow and look at what's coming. So thank you.
Just to clarify and try to simplify your presentation, if I understand correctly, you're intentionally increasing the cost of gas and diesel progressively over the years in order to encourage people to drive electric cars instead, and using the tax money to spend it on whatever the government feels is correct. Is that pretty much correct? My costs will continue to go up in order to drive?
I understand your question. I think what the way this program works, it doesn't care what the price is. It cares what the reductions in emissions are, and it allows the market to set that price.
So you're forcing the
Whether they
reduction in
go up,
emissions.
whether they go up or down, the price goes up or down as a function of the market. What we said is the policy goal is to reduce those emissions.
But you're increasing the cost to the supplier, is what you're saying.
But potentially, what we've seen under Reggie is the prices fluctuated significantly over the time, has actually stayed way lower than we had anticipated.
But it is a tax.
It is a cost of compliance, yes.
Okay, so do it or else you pay.
There are ways to comply without buying allowances, but they're for the most part, people will be buying allowances, yes.
And then lastly, how is the electricity created for these electric cars?
Well, right now, I would look to our stats right now is we're looking towards a 75% renewable energy standard currently, and there's discussion of 100% renewable energy standard. Our electricity emissions are incredibly low and getting lower as we go forward, so.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. What, right now, how is the electricity being created for current electric cars?
For current electric cars,
Yeah.
it's based on whatever you're purchasing from the grid, so it changes on a day-to-day basis.
So is it, but I think what
I
Lisa's
was
trying to say
is it
is
created by burning fossil
solar,
fuels?
Nope.
fossil
generally?
fuels.
Then how is it?
Most of it is from hydro-Quebec,
Quebec. May I answer that more accurately?
if you would like to.
Yes, so, in Vermont at least, Green Mountain Power has a program where you can get a charger from them and they will turn it off on peak times. So for the most part, electric cars can be and will be, as they roll out in the future, charged when the grid wants to, when there's excess electricity on the grid, when there's waste electricity that generally gets wasted. That's first. Second, more globally, the amount of electricity it takes to refine a gallon of gasoline, let alone pump it out of the ground, ship it across the world, and deliver it from the refinery to the pump, and then pump it into your car, just to refine it is enough to move a Tesla, for example, 25 miles, or a Nissan Leaf, 25 miles. So the electricity to fuel these vehicles is already on the grid. Most of it's being wasted, and the rest of it's being put into gasoline.
Hi, my name is Scott Fry. I'm from Springfield, and I've been following this climate initiative, climate change, Essex plan, whatever you folks are calling it this year. And I grew up in New Hampshire, and there's a stark contrast between what goes on in New Hampshire, economically speaking, and tourist speaking, than it does in Vermont. I see the great contrast in tax rates, sales taxes, gas taxes, vaping tax 92%. I see the structure of government in New Hampshire more efficient than here in Vermont. When we're talking about government, and government programs and government computer programs and what you've done, I was following the, I know this is slightly off subject, but I'm getting to a point. The Health Connect system several years ago spent $180 million of your tax money on a website that didn't work right. $180 million. How many people knew that? Nobody, right? No accountability from the government whatsoever on it. You blew off $180 million of our money on a website that didn't work, and then he spent another $125,000 to go look for another company to fix it. So I have very little trust in people, in a general sense, in government, when they can't even hold themselves accountable for blowing off hundreds of millions of our tax dollars. I have very little trust in a group of people that's going to set up a climate initiative based on bogus science that was just put up on the wall saying all those natural disasters were from climate change. You have no proof of that whatsoever. Hurricanes have been going on for thousands of years, floods for thousands of years. You can't blame Irene on Vermont putting up X amount of carbon dioxide, or New Hampshire. This is basically a punishment tax on people that are trying to be prosperous. You want prosperous, you want growth in Vermont, both in a tourist sense and a citizen sense. Don't tax the crap out of us anymore. We've got so many taxes already. You want to institute another tax. You call it market-based, but it's not. It's a tax. It's a punishment tax on the producers of fossil fuels. We all got to use fossil fuels around here. I can't put solar on my house. I already tried. Okay? I don't have the roof space. I don't have the southern exposure. I tried that. We were going to spend $20,000 on that thing. Couldn't do it. A lot of people can't do it. Okay? But you look at this contrast here from Vermont to New Hampshire. You see the prosperity booming over there. You don't see thousands of people leaving New Hampshire every year. You see thousands of people leaving Vermont every year. On the tourist side of things, the folks that come up here for the snow and the lakes, when they find out that we're going to be charging them anywhere from 10 cents to 29 cents a gallon more for their evil gas-powered vehicles, from Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, wherever, they're not gonna come here anymore. They're gonna go to New Hampshire, where they don't get punished for their fossil burning cars over there. I like the idea of transitioning, but the way that Vermont is doing it is just a radical departure from standard, as far as I'm concerned. Like I said, I grew up in New Hampshire, I see the contrast here. I also ran for state office as well. So I've been heavily involved in a lot of my local community stuff and the state stuff, and it doesn't make me happy. Because I wanted to start a business selling stereo gear and doing repairs, but I don't want to do it in Vermont, because I'm gonna get whacked with taxes and fees and mandates and more taxes. I'm gonna go across the river, that's where I'd go.
I just want to reiterate what the fellow in the back said, Tony Seba, TonySeba. He's a Stanford economist, and he believes that the price of batteries and the high-tech cars is going to make them more competitive than internal combustion engines within 10 years. It's going to happen, he's right. Internal combustion engines and fossil fuels are going to be pushed aside by electric vehicles, and it's going to be better, and you won't have to worry about a tax. It's going to happen in the marketplace. You probably all know who Greta Thunberg is. She pronounces her name Thunberg. She quotes I'm going to wave my hand like a chart. We have 8.5 years. If we were to consume at today's rate the fossil fuels, 8.5 years is all we have allowed to put out into the atmosphere if we're going to maintain 1.5 degrees C increase over pre-industrial. 1.5 degrees C is worse than it is today. You may not believe that we got a crisis right now. Right now we're 1.1 degree over pre-industrial, and it's already a crisis. You may not believe that, but in fact that's what the science says. So Greta's even wrong. We've got to do it even faster, and we've got to draw down carbon. That we're putting carbon in the air now, we need to bring it down, and the carbon we put in over the last 200 years, we need to bring it down and put it someplace. I'm not saying where to put it. You can make gravel out of it, you can use it for construction, but we can't just reduce emissions, we've got to draw down. This is good what you're doing, I agree 100% with what you're doing, but we have to go beyond that. So I just want to let you know, Tony Seba and that fellow in the back are right. Thank you very much.
I agree with that. If you do the math of to where we need to be in order to avoid the fateful 450 parts per million of CO2 by the fall of 2032, we actually have to do, we have to get to zero global carbon far before that, which is only 12 years away. So we really only have about, scientists vary as to what their opinion is on the flywheel effect of carbon released and carbon that becomes atmospheric carbon. But in my sense, the best scenario we have based on Mother Nature, which is a very tall order, is that we have to get to near zero carbon on a global basis by 2025, which is 5 years away. So I applaud what you're trying to do, but I underscore the reality is we have to match the problem with an equal solution that solves the problem in time and to the magnitude that's necessary. So that means, getting to a 90% cap reduction by 2025 is what all the numbers that you're using should actually reflect. And that's daunting and it's frightening to all kinds of people, and well, we should never do that and it's crazy. But that's what Mother Nature is telling us all. That's the facts of where we are as a planet in relation to protecting Earth's ecosystems. So we have, what I'm saying is what you're doing is great, but we have to be much, much, much more aggressive with what the tax rate is. The true societal cost of a gallon of gasoline is about $30 when you consider all the societal impacts of what the use of gasoline means. So 27 cents a gallon is pittance compared to the reality of what we're dealing with. So I'm just saying those numbers that you're using have to be much, much more aggressive if we're gonna solve the problem in time. Yeah,
I am, when you, let's say you succeed, we all voted in, and, I think you gave us some pretty big numbers of, revenue, basically, that would be available to then turn around and encourage creative ways and infrastructure change and all sorts of things. I think there's an interesting model in the state that's been really successful, where revenue came out of the property tax return when it got, at the time it got implemented, property tax return, that created the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board model, where local initiatives with ideas and something that they know better than anyone else could work for them as a way of applying with a very rigorous grant system. But that money in Vermont Housing and Conservation Board has been amazingly effective in this state for affordable housing and conservation efforts. And the energy that that's provided the local people to solve those problems it's inspired far more, for leverage, if you wanna call it that. It's gotten so much more done than Montpelier can do from the top down. So I can't imagine that that's the model for all the money. That wouldn't make sense. But I would hope incorporated in the vision of how to then turn around and creating the money and, encouraging the lowering of the emissions, but at the same time, to be what everyone's saying here, we have to be creative and sophisticated about then ramping up the solutions, right? So you're creating a revenue stream to invest for the public good, to ramp that up. And at least a part of that to be available locally. From the ground up, that VHCB model has worked so well already here in Vermont.
I think Vermont should join the TCI for a number of reasons. First of all, just by its nature, it is regional, and when you do anything on a larger basis, it has a greater impact. And Vermont on its own, the numbers you showed, we haven't done well on our own at all in reducing carbon emissions. I like the TCI because it is purposeful and intentional. It targets the transportation sector. There's a tremendous culture in the United States. We depend on our cars. We get lazy, it's convenient. There are many reasons we have to change the culture, and sometimes you have to be a little bit bold with your actions. And finally, we get, people don't talk about the invest part of Cap and Invest very much. And it's an opportunity for Vermont to get money, and if we don't join the TCI, we're gonna lose that revenue.
First, I want to applaud what you're doing. And secondly, I want to say that one of the things that helped me to understand what some of these gentlemen are saying and women are saying here is that carbon stays in the atmosphere for well over 100 years. What we put in the atmosphere is going to stay there for a long time unless we figure out how to not put more there and draw it down. It helps me to understand the gravity of the situation. And the real question I had was, this is a regional compact, but what's being done to prevent what I like to refer to, and I think is referred to economically as the rebound effect, where other regions absorb the carbon that we are restricting, flows at a cheaper price into another region, or goes into heating fuel, or one thing or another, instead of just transportation. So you get lower prices that, in effect, contribute to an increase in the use of the fossil fuels.
I guess I don't anticipate that happening, because our demand for our fuels is relatively static, so you're not likely to see a major upswing either way. We are concerned about what's known as leakage, right? What happens at the borders of this region, what happens to buying behavior if people can purchase fuels in a state that doesn't have this type of regulation. That is a concern. Obviously, along Connecticut River, that is a concern. That tends to be more of a concern than the sort of rebound effect that you're
That's
discussing.
the rebound effect.
Just a couple of points. Things that folks have probably hadn't taken into account, that 100 years ago, Vermont was close to being 80 to 90% deforested due to agriculture and due to using wood for heat and other sources. Now, Vermont is close to 90% forested. Those are trees that take the carbon dioxide that all of us are putting into the atmosphere and using for food to produce oxygen. So that hasn't been taken into account by anybody that I've heard here tonight. The other thing is recycling. How many millions of pounds of CO2 and other toxic chemicals are not released into the atmosphere for 1 ton of plastic that we recycle, 1 ton of glass that we recycle, 1 ton of cardboard, 1 ton of aluminum. Nobody's brought any of those facts and figures here tonight. They're not even taken into the consideration on how we deal with carbon dioxide, which is a naturally occurring gas, by the way. It's not evil. And people got to realize that we breathe out carbon dioxide as well. And I'm again hearing Greta Thunberg. She has 0 science degrees, 0 science background, yet people are quoting from her. Bill
He's
McKibben,
quoting the IPCC.
which is the United Nations, okay, we get it. Bill McKibben, he has no science degree whatsoever, but he's your biggest spokesman for your climate initiative here.
Thank God for him.
Guys,
Yeah.
Can we keep our comments relative to the issue at hand, please, and try to keep the sort of back and forth?
Yeah, you haven't taken those things into
Thank
account. You haven't been taken into account. You're not talking all science here. We're talking a lot of opinions, we're talking a lot of sources that I have no clue where they came from, because I've never heard that we've only have 5 years before tragedy strikes. I mean, we had 12 years from Alexandria Cortez, and I'm not sure where she got those numbers from, but you can't just come in and make up random numbers off of somebody's website and claim it as science. Science is peer reviewed, science is testable and provable. The scientific method is all about provability and repeatability. So when you go back home, start looking into the science aspects of what we're talking about, all of us, not just me either, the science aspects of it, the repeatability.
Thank you.
This is a lot of science going on.
Let's move on.
Can I have the line, please?
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Rugg. I'm a Hartford resident. I'm a civil and structural engineer in Hartford. I have a degree in empirical science. I have a master's degree from Vermont's own Norwich University, the oldest the oldest private engineering school in the country. And I operate a civil and structural engineering business out of my home. I bring money into Vermont from out of state, where most of my work is. And I do that with a very low carbon footprint, because aside from an occasional site visit, I don't commute. We've been Hartford residents, my wife and I, for 20 years or more. My daughter was went to Hartford High School, valedictorian. She's now working on a PhD in atmospheric physics. Climate change is real. Climate change is empirical. We do have the data to support it. Back in the 1980s, when I was reading about this in high school and we didn't really know what to make of it, we didn't have the ice core sample data that we have now that directly shows the correlation between carbon dioxide and global temperatures. We have that now. It's real. I'm here to speak in favor of this. And being a New Englander and not prone to oration, I will sit down now. Thank you.
Yes, I had a statement and also a question. As the model is developed, I have been impressed with the information I've learned recently about how the funds from Reggie have come back into the state, and in part to support weatherization programs. I volunteer for cover in White River Junction. I know a lot of people that have been supported through Capstone and SEVCA and the weatherization monies that have been collected. So I would love to see funds from TCI, which I do support, headed to our most vulnerable populations. Obviously, an increased fuel will impact them. I know that whether I'm paying $2.35 a gallon or $4 a gallon, I tend to travel the same amount of distance. So anyway, I guess I'm just saying that please strongly consider how we can put that money back to support more our rural folks and low income. My question is, you said that this is a gubernatorial decision. Now, you all will be presenting this information to Governor Scott. As a citizen, do we have swaying power by writing to him, or how do you see
Sure,
that?
part of it is through the commenting process we've talked about, we're obviously collecting that information and providing the details to him, but so this starts as a gubernatorial conversation across the region. The legislature is very interested in this process. They've already asked for testimony multiple times over the course of the first month of the session. The timing is a little bit of a challenge for this session, frankly, because if we have a springtime decision, then they may be out of session at that point. They may pass legislation and put it up to the governor's desk that says, if you choose to move forward, you may go forward, you have our blessing. That remains to be seen. But there's certainly not a lack of interest, and I would say that the House and Senate Transportation Committees are taking testimony on this fairly regularly, and it'll probably start to ramp up, and you could watch for opportunities for those sorts of hearings to come up, and if you have an opportunity to come up to Montpelier, you can participate in those hearings. They often will invite people who are sitting along the side of the committee rooms to offer their opinion if there's a moment to do that. You could also get the record of that testimony and provided, so you can review that material. So that's one way to do it. But I would speak with your local reps and senators and have that conversation.
Thank you. I was just wondering if the governor had an alternative to TCI in addressing climate change. Should he think it's too much taxing, et cetera? What alternatives is he offering us and our grandchildren in dealing with this crisis?
So I think in the interim, what's in the budget right now is a massive ramp up in incentives for electric vehicles, more money for weatherization, thinking about how we do use some of the VW money to electrify our bus fleets. There are things that are happening right now that are not contingent on TCI happening. I think the governor's general perspective is he would rather have us live within our means, and if this is a priority, reprioritize revenue towards these activities. But he's still listening and open to the TCI conversation.
Can I ask a follow-up? So what would the implications financially be TCI versus those suggestions that you had?
Well, so I guess I'm not entirely, so if we use existing revenues, then it is just a movement from one priority to another. It is not a additional cost added on to Vermonters for the purchase.
But the impact on our environment would be vastly different if we did TCI as opposed to not.
If we achieved the same set of emissions reductions through programs and investments that got us there without creation of the sort of revenue generation side of TCI, then the effect on our environment is the same.
Is that practical? Is that doable?
Thankfully, my job is not the money piece. I think the tools are the tools. How we pay for them is a conversation we should all be having as a state.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking more about the climate implications of doing one versus the other. Of doing what you were just talking about, EVs and, or doing TCI.
I think as long as we have the scope of programs that are in place that get us the emissions reductions we need, the benefit to TCI is that it establishes that cap and makes, that's the guarantee out of it. If we're doing other programs, then we're projecting out what we think it's gonna take to get there, and we'll work towards those ends. But something like TCI creates a guarantee that the outcome is emissions reductions.
So it would be more likely to get where we need to doing TCI.
Yes.
Thank you.
If all 14 states do sign on, what population are we talking about?
So I think it reflects roughly a third of the total US population. About a third of the sort of vehicle market.
Well, I would tend to, if I could probably find fault with little things in any plan that anybody has. But I would say, if you could get 1/3 of the population of the country moving in a certain direction, the rest of the country's gonna pay attention. And so I think that it's really important to not let little faults here and there slow you down. Another thought I have is, I find that the implementation date of 2022 could be moved up.
So that's a logistics sort of question. If we think about the sort of timeline of what we might need to do between now and then, assuming we don't get legislative authorization this year, and we decided that was required, we'd have to come back in the beginning of January next year, and then go through a full rulemaking process, and that takes 6 to 9 months easily. So you're really that 2022 is and at the same time, we gotta be standing up the administration of the auction programs and all of these things at the same time. So it legitimately is probably the earliest that it could conceivably launch. The way in which we pass laws and do rulemaking tends to be faster than most states, so it can be a 1 to 2 year rulemaking process in other states, and so if we wanna have all the other states along with us, 2022 is about as early as it can happen.
It's a significant fraction of 5 years.
It is, but there's wishing that part away isn't gonna help us get there any faster, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the first part of that last comment. I think it would be really unfortunate if Vermont did not participate. I think that would send a really bad message to the rest of the country. And if 14 states can come together and do this, that sends a great message. But if it starts to fall apart, that doesn't look very good, and we need to act.
I'd like to add my voice to what the lady in the front row said before. I agree, this is absolutely critical, it's important, we can't do too much to try and get a handle on this. But one of the things that I think has to be built into the program is that money needs to be set aside. A percent of the money, something absolute that is not gonna change to mitigate the impacts on people who can't afford this. We can't have people not being able to commute to their jobs. Poor people probably have cars that are least energy efficient. They're probably spending more on fuel. We can't be affecting them in a negative way. It would be wonderful to be able to devote all this money towards other energy saving opportunities and more electric vehicles and more other things. But we can't have a negative impact on the people who really can't afford. So I think you need to say, okay, we're going to use X percent of this money for all these energy efficiency things, but a certain percent is reserved specifically for mitigating the impact on lower income people. And it can't be negotiable, it has to be set, and it has to be an equal part of the program. You can't just go forward and say, well, we'll leave it up to the local jurisdictions, or we'll leave it up to this, or we'll leave it up to that program. It has to be guaranteed.
So, thank you, I appreciate that comment, I think everybody is interested in addressing that particular concern. Just a sort of a way of reference, the REGI program, the legislature appropriated the funds that they were coming to REGI, essentially gave them to the Public Utilities Commission to manage. And so it's been a way to sort of make sure that it is outside of the sort of every year budgetary cycle where kind of unconditional pots of money tend to get moved around. And so that some sort of approach to look at sort of an advisory council or something else to help make sure those resources are continuously being invested in ways that are mitigating some of those low income impacts and making sure we're getting the benefits is something that could be considered. Sure, you had your hand up here.
Yes, I want to emphasize that it has to go through the legislature before it gets to the governor. I know everybody keeps mentioning the governor, but it has to go through the legislature first, so. But I have a question, actually, if we're focusing to move forward to electric cars and more cleaner burning things, and some people are concerned about where we're getting our electricity from in the beginning. A lot of it comes from Hydro-Quebec. Why don't we, in Vermont, try to generate our own power, say through hydro or hydro diversion dams?
We have a fair amount of locally produced hydro now. It doesn't add up to the large scale hydro that we're purchasing from Hydro-Quebec, but there are many existing dams that are producing power for a lot of like the municipally owned utilities are generating from smaller scale hydro on our rivers for sure. So thanks. Okay, I've got a couple repeats. Tom, here.
Yeah, I'd like to just encourage Vermont to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Further, one of the findings that unfortunately wasn't able to show up on the screen today, but is in some of the other background documents that you've shared on your website, is the more ambitious the governors are in addressing climate and setting the cap, the better the benefits are for the Vermont economy. And so I would encourage the governor to go for that 25% cap reduction rather than the 22%. Further, to echo some of the points that this gentleman made at the beginning, the health benefits of TCI far outweigh any of the costs. The Department of Health put together a handy one-pager that I'll pass around that shows that if we hit our climate and clean energy goals within the transportation sector, Vermonters will save over $1 billion, and more than 2,000 lives will be saved from having lower particulate emissions in the air and better transportation choices.
So I'm Beth Greg. I was born here 50 years ago last month, right here in Springfield. And I do believe in lowering our carbon, but I think people really need to go home and look at how the lithium is mined, copper, silicone, how it's produced, and what it does to the air. I do believe in being greener and trying to find other ways, look at hydro, but people need to look outside the box, not just focus on the transportation, but how these batteries and the solar is produced to make these cars work. And the buses.
It's also what happens to them when they're not
And
used in
the environment, right, and
afterwards.
not all these batteries are 100% recyclable. The solar panels definitely aren't 100% recyclable. So I really encourage people, well, yes, we want a greener environment and less carbon. Vermont did, last I checked when I ran for office 2 years ago, was 0.02%. We had a very small carbon footprint. But I encourage you to go home and look and research when lithium, copper, the silicone is mined
and then how it's produced to create these things. Look at the toxins and the percentage that it's putting, of toxins it is putting into the air. Okay, please.
I just wanted to go back to the earlier statement about the effect on low-income folks and kind of start by reiterating that and supporting that concept. And this is kind of one of the main points that I was trying to nudge towards when I was talking about what you do with the money is more important than where you get it from. This is a great, I think this is a great way to, a source of revenue for these kinds of problems, because the effect of burning and consuming fossil fuels, the externalities of that are arbitrarily weigh heavily on low-income people. And you know, that $30 a gallon number that was quoted earlier, I've heard all kinds of numbers between $15 and $30, but it's true. And the bulk of that, a lot of that comes from healthcare costs. And that is driven by the combustion of fossil fuels. So starting this initiative, I want to be clear that I don't really have a lot of optimism that this program is going to have a significant impact on our emissions and climate change relative to the market forces that are coming. I think that it's a good way for us to recognize that fossil fuels have a lot of negative externalities that we need to put into the cost. And that is something that government should be better at doing, and is really the only thing we have to do that kind of thing in the world of economics, to internalize externalities. So that's one of the reasons I support this initiative, even if, you know, the electric vehicle revolution happens before 2024, when this program might realistically get implemented. So please keep going with it, but I also would encourage you, I know this is a harder nut to crack, but we really should be looking at total emissions. Appreciate where we've been on that in Vermont, where we're trying to get to, and that's a harder thing to do at the regional level. But if we're not, you know, again, the transportation is the first disruptive change we have coming. So focusing too much on that now, it's kind of like leaves in the wind. This program is not going to have a real effect on our emissions. And then kind of rolling with that, the emissions, getting to zero emission isn't solving the problem. As was mentioned earlier, I wanted to reiterate that, right? The same exact science that tells us that climate change is real and that mostly driven by human emissions is telling us that if we get to zero emissions today, we still deal with climate change for a couple of decades. So this is where government should be looking in the future. The market is going to solve our emissions problem without a ton of help, but we got to make sure the government doesn't get too much in the way and manages and regulates that transition, right? So set up these programs, take those funds, support the people that are most impacted by the transition and by fossil fuels themselves, right? The low-income folks, the people in those industries that need jobs or some other kind of retraining or some income to get them through the transition, right? That's where this kind of money probably needs to go. And then work towards bigger things, like how do we get the carbon out of the atmosphere, which is something that probably Vermont's not going to do on its own, but hey, we can do a heck of a lot with regenerative agriculture.
Yes.
So let's get those programs funded.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just going to say a suggestion that I think that the proceed funds for the program to be successful and adopted statewide or region-wise, it's important that it's a problem to solve a transportation issue, and all the funds should stay relating to transportation. You know, there's housing issues, there's health issues, there's all kinds of other issues. There's other programs outside of this program to deal with that I think all of the money needs to be rater-proof and to stay within the transportation sector. And the other comment was, I'm fully understanding and agree with the transportation relationship of how the impact on the poor folks are, that needs to be part of the equation. But also keep in mind that spending that money on things like mass transit and other regional or city planning issues and that sort of thing can actually have a greater impact than incentives to low-income people. So there's a mix of where those funds should be allotted, but it should stay all related to transportation. Otherwise, you're gonna have all kinds of politics involved in this program.
Just to be clear, on the revenue, the sort of expenditure of the revenue side, that is a constitutionally delegated responsibility to the legislature, right? So we may come up with programs and proposals that we recommend, but ultimately that is a decision by the legislature. And we only have one-year budgets, and so that they can change every year. And so there are some states that have, sort of lockbox constitutional amendments that could be put into place. But as of right now, it's, the way Vermont works is it's a one-year budget, and every year you can change it. The legislature can change it, so just so everybody's aware. Obviously.
I do have a question. If we don't adopt this, the fuel's still coming into the ports in Portland and Canada and Albany and around. Aren't we still paying for the fee of this and not getting any of the benefit from it?
That is a really good question, and sort of the $64,000 question. We can't. I can't answer that question because it's really a market power question. If you, so let's think about it from the terminal's perspective. If the terminal has a say the terminal in Albany has a compliance obligation in New York and Massachusetts, so it's probably 2/3 or 3/4 of their fuel, or if not more. Are they gonna take that total compliance obligation and spread it out over the costs of all of their fuel? And so everybody gets charged the same whether you're buying from Vermont or buying from New York. They can do that. The only thing that would stop them from doing that is that if a terminal somewhere else is offering a differentiated price for a non-TCI jurisdiction, or is eating more of the cost and therefore lowering their price.
Oh, so we're getting it from various
We get it from
directions right now.
Right now, we get the majority of our fuel on rail cars up from Albany to what was a terminal in Burlington. It's now just offloaded off of the rail cars and put into trucks and ship around. So that's where we get the majority of our fuel at the moment.
So then there is a chance that by not adopting this, we could be paying the price and not getting any benefit. Okay, that's easy enough.
What's that?
We get, as a CDL truck driver, this area here, we get the majority of our fuel from Portsmouth and Chelsea, Mass, because I used to drive down with all the drivers.
So even more likely that
We have to
they're
get
all
our rate from
just gonna charge us, and we're not gonna get any benefits from it if the governor does what the New Hampshire governor did, which is to say, no, we're not gonna join the TCI.
It is possible and very likely, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
Hi, I'm just making a comment. So Vermont spends about $100 billion, $1 billion out of state on fossil fuel expenditures per year. And our own governor said that if we get to 100% electric vehicles on the road, we're actually saving $500 million annually. So regardless what you think of climate change, think about it in the pure dollar sense.
But
we're
most of
saving
our
a lot of money.
silicone comes from Australia, Tibet, and deserts.
You're talking about silica for making,
Lithium.
you just said I'm confused.
Sorry, silica and lithium, sorry. Yeah.
So silicone is what you use to weatherize your windows. Silica is what you would use to make solar panels, which comes from sand.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So sand is pretty inert. Fair enough.
And latex.
Unfinished solar cells are not inert.
But for the batteries,
Okay,
what they're mining is coming from other countries, not mostly from.
Yeah, transportation, we're talking about transportation.
Ma'am?
I'm wondering if you could speak to any unforeseen downsides of Reggie that might apply to TCI as well?
Could you repeat that question?
The young lady asked if there were any unforeseen downsides to Reggie that we might anticipate being part of this program or to modify for. I think one of the things that we've made an adjustment for within Reggie, and it's basically being launched now, is that when the price is significantly, so we have a high end sort of price collar that says if it reaches this price, it will more allowances will be flooded into the market and therefore dropping down the price. We are about to institute in Reggie a sort of bottom level price collar that says if we're getting emissions reductions significantly cheaper than we think we are, and we could be getting more and getting to those goals faster and using some of that S-curve, that it pulls allowances out of the market. We plan to do something similar in TCI as a way to be sort of self-correcting within the market so that we're not relying on the states to get back together and agree on something, you know, a couple years down the road and some implementation time, that there is some market action itself that enables that sort of dynamic change to occur.
Can I add? I think the best example I could think of is that, you know, a very well-intentioned group of states when they started Reggie, hadn't done a program like this, and so they were what turned out to be very conservative with what the cap was, and that resulted in, between that and changing the economy that reduced emissions in a way that the folks didn't realize, there was a lot of excess allowances in the cap. We have more of experience with establishing markets here, so I think that's the one takeaway. Peter's alluded to it as a mechanism that we are building in to be able to adjust to price volatility, both on the low side, if there's too many allowances, that happens automatically, and we also have a mechanism on the high side, so if prices are higher than we anticipate, then extra allowances will go into the market. The idea is to make the market, make it easy to trade, and make compliance simple and possible with people. So I think that's really because you saw the map, the states are very similar. They're taking a lot of that previous experience with designing a functional and a market that is not very volatile. I think that's much to our advantage. Plus, we have the advantage of more carbon markets like the one that exists in California, and then pairing with Quebec as well. So we are learning lessons from things that have happened, both from Reggie and from other folks that have around us. And so I think we are working with a lot more confidence going forward with development of the program as a team. Regionally, it's great.
I was just kind of I don't know what kind of funding your group has in relation to public education, but it seems to me that the first reaction of a lot of folks in New England is that, oh, this is going to cost me something. But in reality, if these incentive monies are spent correctly, it's actually a boon to everyone in the benefits that, maybe 3- and 4-fold benefits versus what we're spending. And I think I would spend some time in an education effort to try to underscore how that can actually happen.
Does our state have a way to influence the emissions, emission standards of cars if they're rolled back and relaxed, and the states say we're not gonna allow, cars to be sold here that are, less than 30 miles per gallon or something like that?
So you just happen to have the resident expert in the Clean Air Act sitting to my right. But I'm gonna give you the layman's answer and she can fill in the details. So the way the Clean Air Act is set up and the way with the California waiver, we as a state are either allowed to adopt the federal standards or California's. We don't have an option to do our own. And if the California waiver goes away, then we only have the federal option. We are preempted from that action at the state level. Did I get that right?
Could you speak to the phenomenon of out-of-staters purchasing fuels here and what that would mean for potential revenues?
Sure. So right now, the sort of math is roughly 20 to 25% of our fuel purchased in Vermont is by out-of-state customers. So if you wanna think about it in terms of if we're basing the share that Vermont would get back based on fuel sales within our boundaries, 25% of that would not be being paid for by Vermonters. We do obviously buy some fuel out of state, but I don't think it is the same levels that we are bringing in, given our tourist economy.
So this would be a way to leverage additional dollars into the state.
I'm not sure it's additional dollars, it just means that they wouldn't be coming from Vermonters directly.
On that note, if you're an out-of-stater, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, or Massachusetts that comes here on the weekend, comes up for 2 weeks or whatever, and the prices on the east side of the border or the south side of the border are 20 to 25 cents less than Vermont, do you think those folks are gonna buy their gas there or in Vermont? You have to take that into consideration, because I would. Yes, they do.
They do. Oh boy, yeah, they do.
Lauren.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Oates. I work for the Nature Conservancy. We have offices in Pulteney and also in Montpelier. We're in all 50 states and a couple of countries as well. I'm new to the Nature Conservancy, so I'm going to speak to a little bit of my past life. So as recently as December, I was the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. And there are a couple of numbers and ideas here that warrant a little bit of elaboration and consideration. The Nature Conservancy is a science-based organization, and if we're still doing credentials, I have 2 degrees in science, so we're going to work with that. The Nature Conservancy has done some research, and to your point, sir, nature can sequester and store carbon, but it can only do up to 30%. And that's if we're doing everything right and we're changing the way that we're changing our land, the way that we have land use development patterns, and that's across the country, not just in Vermont. 30% is obviously not anywhere near 100%. So the Nature Conservancy has also looked into what we should be doing with transportation. Transportation is Vermont's greatest emitting sector. Vermont is the only New England state that has increased our emissions. Every other New England state has decreased since 2005. So that's something to consider as we consider ourselves the Green Mountain State. A couple of numbers, if you can stomach any more. We did some polling, TNC did, in all of the 12 TCI states. And it was only for rural voters in rural towns. Because what's happening in Manhattan is a lot different than what's happening in Springfield and all of the other states. So the way that we move and work is much different than the cities do in these 12 states. We found for this polling, which was bipartisan, there was a left-leaning pollster and a right-leaning pollster that did this together in a collaborative effort, that 80% of rural Vermonters are in support of a clean transportation fund, that we can use revenues generated from it to support EV infrastructure, to support broadband access, which would bring in younger Vermonters and improve our climate, our economy, our climate economy, among other things that we can do to improve rural transportation efforts. So 80%, it's 75% on average across all 12 states, so Vermont's a little bit above average, but that's exceedingly and overwhelmingly in support of a clean transportation fund. And that wasn't even TCI specific, that was just, do you support clean transportation? So that's to the TNC point. I'm not a native Vermonter, so I might go on a little long here. I'll try to be brief. My past job, like I said, I worked for Vermont Emergency Management to the point about disasters. In 2000, in the 2000s decade, we had 6 declared disasters by FEMA. In the 2010s, we had 17. It's a near 3-fold increase, and it amounts to 1.7 disasters per year. It's about just FEMA numbers, so this doesn't include federal highway, it doesn't include individual property damages, just public infrastructure is, I want to get this right because I know I'm on camera, is $8 million per disaster. That's public infrastructure. So at 1.7 per year, you can do the math, that's quite a bit. And if you're thinking, well yeah, Irene was in 2011, so that really sways things. I took Irene out. If you include Irene in that average, it's 19 million per disaster. And Irene was an 87-year event. So people say, oh, it was a 500-year event. It was not. And we're expecting that to change and increase. So these storms are going to increase in severity, and the costs are going to continue to climb. So one of the slides, check my math here, was the lowest, if we do TCI at the lowest scale, is 5 cents per gallon, gets us 18 million per year. FEMA's numbers show that if you are investing in culvert upgrades, if you were doing floodplain restoration efforts to reduce impacts from flooding to our rural climate, to our rural economy, to our rural neighborhoods and communities, then you're saving $7. For every dollar you spend in mitigating impacts to flooding, you are saving $7 in avoided costs. If you put that $18 million in, you get $126 million in avoided damages, and that's just 1 year. That's a lot of avoided damages, and as we anticipate these storms to continue, we're going to be spending more and more money on it. So when you think about that math alone, and that doesn't consider the economic vitality of broadband access or the way that we move to work, that's a pretty significant return on investment and something to consider for something as small as 5 cents per gallon.
I have a question for her, actually.
Oh gosh. I'll let you know if I can answer it.
How many hurricanes did we have last year versus the year before? In the Atlantic?
This is just hurricanes.
No, but I'm
This is
referring to
flood
hurricanes.
and storm-related damages in Vermont alone.
Yeah, but it all depends on weather cycles. How many Atlantic hurricanes did we have?
I do not
in
study
2 years?
Atlantic hurricanes, so I cannot answer that. Sorry.
Well, isn't that what Irene was?
Irene wasn't Atlantic. Yep. And when it hit Vermont, it was a tropical storm.
Yeah, but it was just because of the way the weather pattern was moving.
Yep.
I mean,
I-
we have hurricanes every year. That was just the way the weather went.
Yep, and so just to clarify, thank you, the disasters that I just said, 1.7 per year on the 2010s, includes flooding, it includes snow, wind, ice, any natural hazard. So that's not just hurricanes.
Yeah, but that's constant in Vermont.
And we also
Every
get,
spring it
different.
happens.
we also get fallback from volcanoes, Mount St. Helens, the one in.
Transportation, I think we were talking about
Right.
transportation.
We've got a brief period of time left before we're gonna wrap for the evening, so I would like to take any final comments or questions before we conclude for the evening. Ma'am?
I guess my question with the weather is, what is it everybody here is saying is causing these disasters? How is this issue causing these weather disasters? Because that's what I'm hearing. And I don't understand the answer to that.
I think that there's a long-term conversation that we can have about what is leading those. I'm happy to talk with you further. I'm not sure we're gonna be able to answer it in great detail here.
Humidity.
30 seconds?
If you would like, you may have 30 seconds, I'm gonna hold you to that.
So the basic physics of it is, the warmer the atmosphere, that implies more energy in the atmosphere. The more energy in the atmosphere, the more movement in the atmosphere. The more movement in the atmosphere, the more moisture the atmosphere can absorb because it's warmer. When you add moisture to it and you add energy to it, you get more weather events. That's about it. And
more
if you
severe.
look,
Right.
and they become more severe.
More frequent,
More frequent, more severe. And if you look at the total number of natural disasters over time, we are in a stunningly exponential increase since the beginning of the 20th century, since 1900. And it is just off the charts, the number, though you cannot say whether a single weather event is caused by climate change. That is silly, and it is naive. But you also cannot look at the total number of weather events and not understand that they are impacted dramatically, that the vast majority of severe weather events we experience today are due to climate change.
And you're saying the carbon in the atmosphere is causing.
Greenhouse gas emissions in general, primarily carbon dioxide released by the combustion of fossil fuels.
You know, Lake Champlain was a mile of ice 20,000 years ago. Do you weigh into that, and that's Earth's natural cooling and heating cycle?
Yeah, and we're seeing a change that's unlike anything.
Yeah, but we're
in
on a heating cycle, so.
It's a cycle.
And we gotta learn to manage it or we're screwed.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming this evening.